It's time to get on the ice. Music City Gold is on the air with Kyle Hancock, Daniel Mangrum, and Matt Bain. We are Smashville's best fan-driven podcast, featuring news around the league, the Predators, and the occasional hot take or two. Part of the Penalty Box Radio Network, you're listening to Music City Gold.
And welcome, guys, back to another episode of Music City Gold on the Penalty Box Radio Network. We are brought to you by Seventh Element, and I am your host, Kyle. With me is Matt.
Hey, guys.
And no Daniel, because he unfortunately had an appointment that he could not get out of, because we were actually supposed to record last week, and we had some things come up, so we couldn't, so we rescheduled for today. And then turns out Daniel, later on today, was like, hey, guys, I can't make it, so it's me and Matt trudging through. We're going to get this done today, man.
That's right. It'll be okay. I like to adhere to a rigid schedule myself. I'm fairly OCD of a person, but I remember a famous saying that said, "Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape." So this is a good little exercise for me to learn how to adapt and do it at a different time other than what was scheduled.
The noise you just heard on the phone is we do have a guest with us today. Since Daniel couldn't make it, we asked Robby Stanley of the Locked On Predators podcast. And Robby, correct me if I'm right, it's the new radio show on 102.5 called The Smash Brothers with Adam Fingen, correct?
That is correct. And it could be the greatest thing ever or the worst. We're still trying to determine how that's going to be.
Well, I will say I enjoyed you guys' use of the Smash Brother gifts because I'm a big Smash Brothers fan. Full disclosure, Smash Brothers Melee forever. That's my absolute favorite one.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm partial to the N64 one myself, but I think Adam really just enjoys the new one on the Switch. I think that's when he really first got into it. He hasn't told me that, but that's kind of the vibe I get.
So who was your go-to character on the 64 one? Because for me, I was a big either Link fan or Luigi fan.
I was big into Link too, and then Captain Falcon. I loved Captain Falcon on the N64 one, and Thomas as well. Like I kind of rotated around, but my two main ones were Link and Captain Falcon. I was better with Captain Falcon.
Matt, do you have one?
I played it, but I didn't own it, so I just played at friend's house. Whatever was available. I might have played the same guy, but I don't remember his name. So,
see, the biggest difference, Matt, when you took from the 64 version to the Melee version, was the speed of how everything moved. I went back and played the 64 version a while back, and it's so much slower compared to the rest of them. Think you agree with that, Robby?
Oh, 100%. And you know, I think I have the same Nintendo 64 I've had since 1995. Like, I've never gotten a new one. It's just the same one. And every now and then I'll go back and play it, and I'm like, this is both the greatest and the worst thing of all time. Because when you're growing up, you think, okay, these graphics are outstanding. Like, it's never going to get any bigger than this. And then you'll go back and play, like, either Smash Bros. Or who knows what else on Nintendo 64, and you're like, I can barely see what's going on. How did I ever play?
Now, do you have GoldenEye?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I have plenty of memories with Matt and Daniel, a couple other guys I grew up with, just all-night bingers of 4-player GoldenEye. Loved it. And like you said, the graphics of that time, of that game especially, were amazing. The level design was great, and now I look at it now, I'm going, man, it's just block shapes running around.
It is. It is. And somebody would always cheat on GoldenEye, and they would end up being Oddjob, who was like 5 feet shorter than everybody else. So you have to adjust your aim, and by the time you held the trigger long enough to aim down low, you were already dead.
See, my brother, we used to play it a lot, just me and him back and forth, and we'd always go and get all the additional settings, and we used to play a variation where we would use the proximity mines. That's all we did. Just threw them everywhere. Yeah. And it was just a nice little fun game of, you know, which step is going to be your last. Loved it.
Just slaps only? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of options out there.
Matt, you're quiet. Did you not play games growing up?
No, not really.
What did you do growing up?
Well, there's still time.
There's still time, exactly. I can be a new age hipster and go back to the old school. Yeah, I didn't have all the cool stuff as a kid, I guess. I do happen to remember the school I went to. I don't know if it was like a special sleepover night or whatever, how I got introduced to this, but I remember, and I still remember it, the classic NHL game from the Nintendo original. And I remember it being, you could pick from 3 guys. There was like a small guy, and then there was a huge fat guy that was really powerful, and there was a guy in the middle. You could be only 3 guys, and it was extremely hard, that video game. And I don't know if that stands the test of time, but I still remember that as being one of my favorite NHL games, actually.
That sounds like NHL 94.
No, it's older than that.
Like NHL 94.
It might be 94 then. I'm not sure, but I remember that.
See, I've still got my original Nintendo too. And my wife found it the other day and she's like, what are you doing with this? And she's like, you need to get rid of it. And I was like, don't you dare touch that. I was like, it works to this day still. I've got the gun and everything.
That needs to be the last time she brings that up. My wife said the same thing about my Nintendo 64 when we moved in. I said, I don't even want you to look at this thing ever again. This is mine.
Just talking about this, Matt, with Robby, I feel like just a connection on another level, man. You got to get on this level.
I know it brings back the sentimental value. It might only be worth $10, but it's worth a whole childhood of memories, I can tell. That's one of those things that goes in the man cave, in the closet where the wife's not allowed in the man zone, for sure.
That is correct.
So on man caves, this actually goes right into my topic on Preds. So we're actually redoing one of the rooms in my house for an office because my wife decided that, hey, you can't have one blank bedroom and an office space, and I want your office for a guest bedroom. So over the past month, I've been moving everything from one room to another. And I was going through my closet of some stuff, and I found my newspapers back when Mike Fisher retired and when the Preds made the Stanley Cup playoffs. It was amazing. I'm sorry, Stanley Cup final playoffs. Yeah, I was excited. And I told her, I said, we got to go buy frames for this. And so she agreed to it. So small victories, guys. Small victories.
That's nice. That'll make some nice.
Small victories are all you get when you get married.
But like I said, we're here to talk some Preds. So let's get into it. So Robby, Peter Laviolette was fired from the Preds on January 6th. And so John Hynes from the New Jersey Devils comes in. And it's been about 13 games. The team has went 7-6 so far underneath his reign. We know how Lavi coached the team. We know how his system went. We know how the mindset of the Preds went. But with John Hynes, we're seeing just a little bit of a difference. You know, here a game or two, we'll see a flash of this is a team that we think could make the playoffs. And then we have a game or two where we're like, oh no, this is the exact same team we've always had. But being somebody who has talked with John Hynes after games, seen the team in practice since then, what is the biggest change you think John Hynes has brought to the team so far?
Well, I think there's a couple things. And I'll start with just kind of a stylistic way that they've gone about doing different things. Defensively, you may have noticed they've gone from basically what was man coverage under Peter Laviolette to now they're more of a hybrid zone concept that they're running under John Hynes. So if you'll notice, like, there's usually always somebody in front of their net on defense in the defensive zone. And under Peter Laviolette, that wasn't always the case. You would see defensemen chasing guys up the wall or along the corner battling for pucks. And you'll still see that from time to time. But more often than not, you'll see at least one defenseman right in front of the net playing more of a zone concept. And I think that's more of a simple change that you make defensively to make sure you're not running around out there and getting caught out of position. There are certain advantages to playing man-to-man. Like if you win your battle in man-to-man and you're able to get the puck back, you usually have a pretty good chance of having an odd man rush going back the other way. But there's also some risk as well. If you get beat, you're probably going to give up a quality scoring chance. So I think the Predators have taken kind of more of a safer route defensively and gone with a zone concept. And for the most part, I think it's worked out pretty well. Every now and then you'll see some breakdowns, but mostly I think they've been better in terms of their defensive zone play as a whole. Offensively, I think it's kind of been a little bit more of a simple change. And I think when you take a look at what they've been able to do offensively, not as much quantity as they've had under Peter Laviolette, but the quality has improved. And I think a big reason for that is if you remember back when Peter Laviolette was the coach and the system they were running, they used to come out with a phrase that said, you know, our defensemen have the green light to join the rush whenever they want to. And a lot of times that meant leading the rush. And this is no disrespect to Rowan Josi or Ryan Ellis or Ekholm, any of those guys, because obviously they're super talented. But you really don't want your defensemen kind of leading the rush all the time. If you'll watch them play now, there are still kind of instances when Roman Josi will join the rush and lead it that way, but it's not happening anywhere near as much as it was before. There's been a heavy emphasis on, hey, when you get the puck in the D zone or you get it in the neutral zone, get your head up and find the forwards and get the puck to the forwards as much as you possibly can. And I think that's a huge reason why we've seen Mikael Granlund specifically come alive, because that plays right into his strength when he's able to operate on the rush and make plays that way. So not too many changes that I think they've been able to make, quite frankly, just because there's not a ton of practice time this time of year. I think to implement every change that John Hynes wants to make, it's honestly probably going to take an entire training camp. in order to do that. But those are some of the things that I've noticed that he's been able to do. And I think the other thing that he's working on is just the mentality of this group. He mentioned the phrase mental fortitude a ton. He's trying to get this team to be tougher mentally, to have some pushback in their game. There have been some mixed results on that front. You think back to the trip, not this trip, but the one before in Washington and in New Jersey. I think that was a pretty good example of what he was talking about. You know, you're down in the game, you're down heading into the third period, and you find a way to battle back and win games. There's still been kind of a mixed bag in terms of the pushback in their game since then. So those are the changes that I think that Hynes has both implemented and that he's still trying to implement with this group as they're currently constructed right now.
So bringing change from a coaching perspective to the team has to bring about a change in mentality to the team. And that's a word we get thrown around a lot, is mentality. And I know your co-host, Adam Vinnigan, published an article a couple weeks ago that was titled, "Hynes Doesn't Have Enough Time to Repair the Predators' Mindset This Season." And if you look at the Preds organization, it's kind of a mindset we've seen all season thus far. The team kind of hits the first sign of a challenge or adversity, and they seem to fall apart. So if Hynes doesn't have enough time to repair this quote-unquote mentality, what can he do, in your opinion, to mitigate that?
Well, I think some of it is just coming from examples. Like I mentioned the Washington and New Jersey game a week ago, or a week and a half ago, however long ago that was now. I think it's easy to point to and say, look, when you guys stick with it, when you stick with the plan that we've put out in front of you, good things can happen. Is it always going to happen? No. Are there going to be times in the game where you're pushing as hard as you can and you just fall short? Of course. I mean, there's going to be times where that happens. But you also have to understand, like, it's the National Hockey League. I mean, you're going to go down in games. Like, you're going to get behind 1-0. There are going to be times where you get behind by 2 or 3 goals. That doesn't mean that you have to fold the tent and just pack it up and come back next time. And too often this year, that's been what's happened, essentially, with the Predators. And they've even admitted that when I've talked to them in the locker room. They said, there have been too many times this year where things haven't gone our way and we just stop. Like, we just kind of fold the tent. And it's pretty mystifying to me, and I know to a lot of fans out there, to hear that from this group, just because you take a look at how much experience this core group has together. I mean, a lot of them have been to the Stanley Cup final. A lot of them have won a President's Trophy. There's been a ton of success, and you don't get success in the NHL without having to battle through some type of adversity along the way. So the fact that we've even had to have this discussion this year, I think has been pretty surprising to me, given how veteran of a group this is. But years are different. I mean, sometimes you just go through things and the confidence just isn't there. And I think that's a large part of what the Predators have been struggling with and been dealing with this year. I just don't think they're a very confident hockey team. And sometimes when that happens, you second guess yourself. Sometimes, fans think maybe they're not trying. I think sometimes the opposite is true. They're trying too hard, and that takes them out of their game, rather than just kind of reading and reacting. So I think, if things continue to go the way that they have, as you mentioned, where the mental fortitude and the pushback is hit or miss, sometimes it's not there, and a lot of times it's not there, then I think David Poile has to take a pretty long look this offseason. And number one, trying to figure out why that is. I think that's a challenging thing to try to figure out. And number two, if you can figure out what it is, maybe you have to make some personnel changes in order to kind of accommodate for that, because this can't happen again next year where you bring back a group that has shown that the pushback in their game isn't there. You got to do something as a general manager to fix that part of it, and as a coach as well. I mean, some of that's going to be on John Hynes as they move forward, not only the rest of this year, but next year as well. And I do think they've made some progress in that area. I think we've shown a little bit of pushback and seen a little bit of pushback in their game, but certainly not consistently enough. And that's the next challenge for Hynes and his coaching staff.
Okay, Robby, so changing gears just a little bit, I want to talk about the offense. So we've talked about, that this team has some pushback issues, but one thing we've also noticed that the team has an issue with just capitalizing on the offense they have with them. So, for example, you've got Matt Duchene, Kyle Turris, Craig Smith, Ryan Johansson, Victor Arvidsson, and Mikael Granlund, who are all having down years. Elliot Freeman on his 31 Thoughts blog said he spoke to David Poile recently, and Poile was quoted as saying, "You understand that this can happen to one or two players, but so many of them, in regards that the fact that their scoring is down overall. In fact, one of the most offensive lines we've seen so far for the Preds this season has been the line of Nick Bonino, Craig Smith, and Rocco Grimaldi. And those guys are producing, but our top scorers aren't there. And when I looked at the players earlier, those players I mentioned bring around $36.3 million of cap space, and we're just seeing down years from all of them. Is it possible that this team is just snake bitten completely?
Well, I mean, you would certainly think so. I mean, when you read off those numbers you just wrote off, and look, this goes back to a saying you hear all the time, not only in hockey, but in sports in general, right? I mean, your best players have to be your best players, and that's probably the most cliche saying of all sayings, but it's 100% true. And that's, I think, a big part of why the Predators are where they are this year. I mean, two in particular really stand out to me, and you've mentioned, Turris and Craig Smith and Ryan Johansson, Kyle Turris. I mean, two of those guys really stand out to me, and that's Ryan Johansson and Victor Arvidsson. They just don't look anywhere close to the same players as we've grown accustomed to them being. I still think Duchesne, I mean, he hasn't been great, but he's been okay. I mean, he's going to end up probably around 50, 55 points, but if you look at his career, that's basically what he does. And I tried to tell people that before they signed him. I think it's a good move that they signed him. I think he's going to be a good player here for a long time. But he's not really the 70-point guy that he showed to be last year in Columbus. And that, if you look back at his career, it really kind of spells it out that way. He's typically a 55-point guy, maybe a 60-point guy, and he's probably going to end up somewhere around that number this year as they close out the season here. Two to me that have to pick it up are Ryan Johansson and Victor Arvidsson. And I know Arvidsson got hurt earlier in the year, and I'm still not convinced that he's 100% healthy right now. He just doesn't look the same to me. I think the effort is still there. But if you remember, I mean, Arvidsson gets most of his offense and most of his chances off the rush, and that's just not happening for him this year. His shots per game are way down. His production is down, obviously. And look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. You look at him, he's not the biggest guy. So if you start getting in a cycle game with him and putting him in front of the net and having him battle for pucks along the wall, he's not going to win too many of those battles. And it's not for a lack of trying. It's just because he's not physically, imposing. He's much smaller than most of the competition that he's going up against, but he's been able to overcome that with his speed and his ability to create off the rush. And he's got an absolutely great shot that when he's open, he can utilize well. He just hadn't been getting open very much and has not been able to take advantage of opportunities off the rush for the most part this year. Ryan Johansson, his production 5-on-5. Look, I've made the argument the past probably 2 or 3 years that Ryan Johansson has been their strongest player 5-on-5. I fully believe that he has driven this offense. Even last year when Forsberg and Arvidsson missed a lot of time, that first line with him on it was still productive because he was kind of driving the bus. I don't know what's going on with him this year, but it just hasn't looked the same. He's been a little bit better as of late, but there's still another level I think he can get to and that he's going to have to get to. And you got to remember, like you said, I mean, he's making $8 million per year. So that's going to be something that you're going to need a lot more production for that amount of money than you've been getting. So that's got to be, I think, probably the most frustrating part of this season for David Poile is the guys that he's brought in and paid big money to, like Johansson, like Arvidsson, to a certain degree Turris, even though I think he's been better. Mikael Granlund as well struggled for the majority of this year, obviously has come on in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but they have not been consistently good. And that can't happen when you're paying as much money to these guys as they're paying.
Well, I think that kind of brings up the elephant in the room question. The Preds are currently standing on the outside looking into the playoff position. So going forward, seeing how they are underperforming, they're kind of on the cusp. Maybe they make the playoffs, maybe they don't. Do you see the Preds going forward as being buyers or sellers at the trade deadline? If there are going to be any moves made, who do you foresee possibly being dealt? Perhaps Craig Smith or Mikael Granlund come to mind because they're unrestricted free agents. But also, I kind of look in my mind, I've seen Craig Smith on a roster for a while. I'm growing kind of fond of him as being a staple to this team, honestly. He's fairly consistent. So I wonder, is there anybody on this roster that's considered to be untouchable as far as trades go, as far as anybody that they won't deal? And is that a tough question considering how it went down with Shea Weber and everybody thought he was kind of untouchable as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to kind of the old saying that people say, Wayne Gretzky got traded. So if Wayne Gretzky can get traded, pretty much anybody can get traded. Now, having said that, they're not going to trade Pecorino. They're not going to trade Roman Josi. They're probably not going to trade Ryan Ellis or Matthias Ekholm either. I doubt very seriously they trade Matt Duchene. And I'm talking about not only at this trading deadline, but as we move forward in the next couple of years here. I would just be surprised if any of those guys get moved. To answer your first question, I don't think it's very likely that they're going to be a buyer at the trading deadline this year. And if they are a buyer, it's not going to be anything really that big. I don't think. Number one, they don't have a lot of assets to use, nor do they have some assets that they should use. And number two, I just think from a salary cap position, you have to be cognizant moving forward, especially if you go out and get somebody with term, that you're going to have a lot of decisions to make. I mean, Roman Josi's contract kicks in next year. You have to decide whether or not you want to enter into negotiations with Mikael Granlund and Craig Smith. I mean, there are a lot of things that you have to account for as a team that's kind of inching up closer and closer to that cap. So I would be very surprised if the Predators are a buyer this year. And if they do decide to go that route, I would expect it to be a minor move. I think the more likely option is that they'll sell. And if they do that, I think Granlund and Smith are the two names to come to mind. And I think this next week here is going to go a long way in determining what David Boyle does. I mean, they've got some tough games coming up against Vancouver. They have New York Islanders on Thursday night, and then a back-to-back with St. Louis. I mean, if you lose 3 out of 4 of those games, you're probably going to have to be a seller at that point. Like you're going to be probably 5-6 points out of a playoff spot at that point. And I think David Boyle really hasn't made up his mind yet, but I would be very surprised if they were a buyer this year. I think the more likely scenario is they either stand pat and do nothing if they're still in a similar position where they are right now, where they're barely on the outside looking in for the playoffs, but you don't really want to give up on it yet. They're probably more likely to do nothing at that point. And if they fall out of it here in the next week and a half, where you go on a losing streak and get ice cold and you lose 4 of the next 5 or whatever the case may be, I think it's pretty likely at that point that Granlund and Smith could be on the trading block. And remember, just because you trade, Mikael Granlund or Craig Smith at the trading deadline, that doesn't mean that you can't re-sign one, if not both of them, in the offseason. And I wouldn't be surprised if they end up deciding to go a seller route where they trade Craig Smith, get what they can for him, and then say, hey, look, come July, we'll be talking to you. We'd love to have you back. We've seen that happen throughout the league on numerous occasions. But certainly some interesting decisions that David Boyle is going to have to make. And the tough part for him is he doesn't have a whole lot of time left to make them.
So you're talking about moves that David Boyle could possibly make. So one question I had, and it's really interesting. So the Preds are big rivals with the Jets. And everybody in the hockey world has been talking that one of the biggest names on the Jets team is Dustin Byfuglien, that him and the Jets are going to be mutually terminating their contract with each other more than likely. Byfuglien hasn't skated the entire season, and he has a huge presence on the blue line. I think back to the game, I can't remember which playoff series it was against Nashville, where he basically manhandled 2 of our players in a ref during a fight. Dude's massive. So if him and the Jets do indeed part ways, like it looks like they're going to, and he doesn't retire, could he be somebody that the Preds possibly look to pick up to bolster the blue line? I mean, because you've got Dan Hamhuis, Matt Irwin, and Yannick Weber all UFA at the end of the season.
I think there's a chance they could take a look at him for sure. Now, if I'm the Predators and I'm David Boyle, there's probably a certain number I'm willing to go to, and that number to me probably is not much above $3.5-4 million per year, because like you said, Kyle, I mean, he hasn't played all year. There were some injury concerns heading into the year where he really hasn't skated. I think at one point was contemplating retiring. So we'll see what decision he makes at the end of all this and whether or not he continues to want to still play. But, you're talking about a guy who's got a mileage on him, played a lot of hockey. And, to be honest with you, at the end of the day, when you take a year off and you're his age, I would be very wary if I'm an NHL general manager of what I would be comfortable giving him. And certainly I think the Predators should take a look at him. They should kick the tires on him if he continues to want to play. I think a lot of teams around the league are going to do that, but I would not get into a bidding war with Dustin Byfuglien. I think their blue line, for the most part, is fine. I think you're going to continue to see Dante Fabro improve. I think next year he's going to be a lot better. than he's been this year. And like you said, I mean, they are going to have some holes to fill. Hamuse, Irwin, Weber, all more than likely will not be back next year. If I had to guess, that gives some opportunities for some guys in Milwaukee to take that next step and come up here and play full-time NHL minutes. And maybe David Poile does look at adding some free agency defensemen in the offseason. But, you know, I wouldn't be very comfortable with giving Dustin Byfuglien a big contract if I were David Poile.
Well, I personally think they should keep Dan Hamuse on the team until he scores a goal. That man just cannot. He's one of the few remaining players left. And at this point, I'm like, yeah, Hamuse is probably not coming back, but I still want to see him get a goal on the score sheet.
I thought we had one the other night. Bonino tipped it, but I thought for about a half a second, I thought, this is it. He's done it. But then we were all robbed.
Well, I'm not sure how much cap space there will be to sign a big name like Byfuglien going forward here to get any kind of a deal out of them. So really, I think a lot of the progress to come to the Predators here soon is going to really depend on younger players developing. So we've had a couple glimpses of Jakub Trenin and Colin Blackwell thus far. Trenin, he has scored 2 goals and 4 assists in 17 games, and Blackwell has scored 2 goals and 3 assists in 21 games. So now that we've had a little look at them, how do you think they're developing going forward, and what do you think of their overall status moving forward?
Well, I've been very impressed with both of those guys, especially Trenin. I think his size and kind of the straight line way in which he plays the game is an element the Predators don't really have. And he's got some skill, obviously, as you mentioned there, to go along with it. And I'll be honest with you, when we went to training camp this year and he was playing in the preseason, I thought he had, you know, a fairly decent training camp. But really in the back of my mind, I thought, you know, this year is kind of put up or shut up for Jakub Trenin. And I wasn't very confident that he was going to be able to be as productive, certainly as he's been this year, but certainly not enough to get to the NHL level. And he has proven me wrong. I think he's played extremely well. And I think, quite honestly, if you're asking me, I think he's earned a full-time spot in the NHL lineup. Now, obviously, when you have as many one-way contracts and as many veteran players as the Predators have, particularly at the forward spot, sometimes that's hard to do. But I certainly think next year Jakub Trenin is going to be a part of their plans. I think he's going to make the team out of training camp, and I think he deserves to be there. Colin Blackwell, I think has played very well as well. I mean, he's not the most skilled guy. He's not going to put up a ton of offense, but he brings the same level of energy every single night. And quite frankly, the Predators haven't had a lot of guys this year that have brought the same level of intensity and energy every night. And I think that's a big reason why he's been able to be effective is every shift he goes out there, you know what you're going to get out of Colin Blackwell. And I think that could be a lesson to some other guys on the roster as well. So I've been very impressed with what I've seen out of the two of them. And I think both of them have warranted long-term consideration in terms of being NHL regular players. I think they've been that good.
Now, one question I want to add on real quick, Robbie, this was not in my notes that I sent you earlier today, but I want to talk real quick on Austin Watson, because Jakub Trenin and Colin Blackwell, like we all agree, have been doing great. And I think that may leave Watson being one of the odd men looking in. We've seen him scratched a couple times under John Hynes. Tonight, he's going to be playing against Vancouver. But I was looking at some stats on him on Evolving Hockey, and I noticed that one thing is that his goals per 60 minutes is about a 3.92, which is 2 more goals compared to Cal Yarncrook, who is second on goals per 60 at 2.35. And then when it comes to his shots against that he allows, he's allowing around 63 shots per game when he's on the ice compared to Yannick Weber, who he just edges out at 62 shots. So with how well, I guess circling back, how well that Jakub and Trenin are doing, do we expect to see Watson sitting more in the press box and eventually maybe not being on the Preds team, despite he still has quite a bit of term left on his contract with the Preds?
Well, that's the thing. They signed into a 3-year deal back in October. So that contract that they signed into looks, I think, worse now. Now, the money on it and the term on it are really not that big a deal. I think it's a $1.5 million AAV. So I think it's a $4.5 million total contract. So it's not huge money that you're talking about, but there's no question he struggled this year. And I think if you look at some of the stats you talked about there, and then just the eye test as well, I mean, he just hasn't played well. And that's a big reason why, since John Hynes has taken over, a lot of times Austin Watson has found himself in the press box. I think he's been a healthy scratch in each game on this road trip up until the game against Vancouver. And I think you might see that happen more often as they move forward here. Look, I mean, we talked about it being a fresh start for guys like Kyle Turris and Mikhail Granlund when John Hynes took over. It kind of gave them a clean slate in which to operate. It's also a fresh start in maybe a negative way for other people as well. I'm not sure that Austin Watson would be sitting this much and this often if Peter Laviolette was still the coach. I think Peter Laviolette really likes Austin Watson. But, you know, when you come in and you bring a new coach in, sometimes them not being familiar with you gives them kind of a 30,000-foot view of the team, and they're more likely to make decisions like that. I mean, UC Saros just started 3 games in a row. It's not very often that you've seen that happen when Pekka Rinne has been healthy and available. So when new coaches come in, sometimes, you know, they don't have a whole lot to go on, so they're just kind of basing everything off what they've seen, and what they've seen so far has not been very impressive from Austin Watson. So what this means for his long-term future here in Nashville, I'm not sure. Like I said, he's got 3 more years left on his deal, so the Predators are probably stuck with him that way. I'm not sure there's a ton of trade value out there if they wanted to go that route. So you may be stuck with him, and he may still be a part of this team as we go forward here. But there's no question he's had a rough year. It's not only been him that's had a rough year, but he certainly has struggled. I think both from an eye test perspective and analytically, as you pointed out there as well.
Well, let me ask you a question that we love to talk about here is the Norris Trophy race. We love to talk about our defensemen and Roman Josi. We saw the midseason voting, and it looked like it was massively in Karlsson's favor to nab the Norris this year, despite being fairly close in points and goals and whatnot. So it's likely that Karlsson will get the Norris. But if that happens to be true, do you think there is some amount of talk that should be had as far as nominating Roman Josi for the Hart Trophy consideration? Not something I'd really considered, but if you look at his resume for the Preds, he has first place points, first in assists, and he's third in goals for the Preds organization.
I think it's certainly worth considering. I mean, you're talking about a guy that if he continues at this pace, he might end up with 80 points this year. So for anybody, that's a really, really good season. For a defenseman, I mean, you're talking elite level, exceptional status of a season in terms when you start talking about an 80-point season. Now, the thing that's working against Roman Josi from both a Norris Trophy standpoint and I think eventually what will work against them from a Hart Trophy nomination standpoint is team success. Like it or not, like that's how voters operate. That's how these awards are typically given. It's very difficult to win a Norris Trophy when your team doesn't make the playoffs. It's pretty much impossible to win a Hart Trophy if your team doesn't make the playoffs. So if the Predators find themselves on the outside looking in, I think it's going to be really difficult for Josi to win either one of those awards. I think it's a lock at this point that he's at least going to be nominated for the Norris Trophy, and that'll be the first time in his career that he gets nominated. He'll probably finish second. I think John Karlsson, it's going to be really difficult for Josi to surpass John Karlsson at this point. And Pierre LeBrun joined us the other day on the Smash Brothers and kind of went on a rant about how the Norris Trophy voting operates and how basically it's turned into, hey, which defenseman finishes with the most amount of points, and that's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about the best all-around defenseman. And I think you can make a pretty strong argument that Roman Josi is and has been the best all-around defenseman in the National Hockey League this year. But unfortunately, just with the way the voting works, points are going to factor into it. John Karlsson's probably going to finish ahead of Josi in points, and team success factors into it as well. So I think because of those two things, it's going to be difficult in order for Josi to win either one of those awards. But if you're asking me, I think there's a pretty strong case you can make for both the Norris and the Hart Trophy. I mean, Roman Josi has basically physically carried this team to where they're at this year. Without Josi, I mean, this team would be near the bottom of the league just with the way that they played for the majority of the year. So I think he absolutely deserves consideration for both the Norris and the Hart Trophy. Unfortunately, I don't think he's got much of a chance at this point of winning either one of them.
And that's a shame because I would like to see Roman win a trophy. I know a couple weeks ago we were talking about this and just the fact that you said Pierre was ranting about, we kind of ranted about the same thing, that the Norris Trophy should be the all-around defenseman, but as Matt told us that he's a big defense guy, And it's a lot harder to quantify the defensive attributes more so than you can just quantify straight up points.
Sure. Yeah, there's no question about it. And, we've improved a lot in terms of the way we evaluate things with the metrics that we have available to us now. But you're right. It's still very, very difficult to evaluate a person's individual defensive impact because so much revolves around the other four defenders on the ice as well as the goaltender as well. So probably never going to be perfect in that area in terms of evaluating a defender's impact. But like I said, I think Roman Josi, you can make a pretty strong case, has been the best defenseman in the league this year.
So the $1 million question that we have here is that the Preds are on the cusp of the playoffs. We mentioned earlier in our season that the Preds are kind of on a bell curve. They went a while where it was no playoffs, first round, second round, Stanley Cup playoffs. And then it's been second round, first round. And if that bell curve holds true, then they won't make the playoffs this year. So if they don't make it, Robby, what happens? Does Spoil go in a fire cell? Does he say, I'm done with the whole thing and go somewhere else? Or, what does our fearless GM do? Does he have any magic left in him?
I don't think he's going to go on a fire sale just because I don't think he's going to be able to go on a fire sale. When you have these long-term contracts like they have, it can be very difficult to move them. Now, having said that, if they miss the playoffs and things unravel here in the next couple of months, there's no way this team is coming back here next year and looking the same. And what I mean by that is one of these core players that I think fans have grown really attached to, you might see one of them on the move, whether it's Ryan Johansson or Victor Arvidsson. I doubt very seriously it's going to be Philip Forsberg. But I think the team is going to look pretty significantly different next year if things continue to unravel the way that they have. Because like you said, it's not just really a one-year thing. They've won the President's Trophy, got beat in the second round to Winnipeg, and it just kind of was what it was. You lost in the second round in Game 7 to the second-best team in the league statistically at that time. So you said, okay, we'll just come back next year and see how it goes. They won the division, and that's certainly impressive. But there was never a point last year in the first round against the Stars where they were in control of that series. Quite honestly, if it wasn't for Pekka stealing the game in Game 3, they would have got beaten in 5 games. So I do agree with you. I think the trajectory that they've been on has not been pointing in the right direction. I think that's a large reason why Peter Laviolette was fired. And if they end up missing the playoffs this year, John Hynes is going to be back. I've already had people messaging me on Twitter asking when they're going to fire John Hynes. They're not going to fire John Hynes this year. It's not going to happen. So keep that in mind. He will be back. He 100% will be the coach of the Nashville Predators to start training camp next year. But I think there's a pretty good chance this team could look significantly different. The question then becomes, okay, who can David Poile move and still get some value out of? And what kind of free agency position are they in to go in from a salary cap perspective? And how many trades do they have to make to maybe navigate into a better position in free agency in terms of the way the salary cap is kind of constructed?
So, Robby, real quick before we let you go, last time we had you on the show, we asked you about what your favorite media stories were. And as we bring people on the show, we just still like to get to know them a bit more. So I want to ask you this time around, what is your favorite NHL arena you've been to outside of Bridgestone? And what is your favorite, hockey food to have during a game?
Favorite NHL arena I've been to outside of Bridgestone is probably Madison Square Garden in New York. It's just awesome. Number one, it's Madison Square Garden. It's the most famous arena in the world. And number two, when I went to it, it was right after they did $1 billion worth of renovations into it. So it just looks awesome. So that's probably my favorite arena that I've been to. The American Airlines Center in Dallas is also very nice if you haven't been to there. It's what I describe it basically as like a gigantic Ryman Auditorium. It kind of has that look and feel to it. But those are probably my two favorite arenas in the league outside of Bridgestone, which I think is also very nice. Favorite food? That's a good question. In the Preds kind of bring us different stuff every game, so there's not really one go-to that I have. But in the playoffs one time, they brought us some ice cream sandwiches, some Purity ice cream sandwiches, and I think I had 7 of them in one game because
Wow.
it went into overtime. And coincidentally, they never brought them again. So I think I convinced them to, for probably the health of everyone around us, to never bring back the ice cream sandwiches. But that was my all-time favorite.
Sounds like they ran out after that game.
They did.
Man, I would love it. Ice cream sandwiches in
Yeah.
a game?
That sounds like a good time. Not going to
Oh,
lie.
it was awesome.
Why don't they have that?
Into the game.
You're in a hockey arena. That's brilliant. Have ice cream sandwiches.
It's never too cold for ice cream.
It's not.
I hate you so much right now, Matt. Goodness. But Robby, man, thank you so much for joining us. We'll let you have the rest of your night, and we'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, boys. Thanks for having me. Anytime. I appreciate it.
So switching gears here, Matt, I want to ask you a question.
All right.
Do you like testing?
Sure. Love it.
Have you played Portal?
I have. That's one video game I have played, Kyle.
It's a good game. And I always think about the character GLaDOS. In fact, she's my favorite video game villain of all time. Just because she's got that just psychotic rage to her, and it's just, she has one goal, to make you test. That's all it is. If you die, so what? She'll keep testing. And do you have any idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about testing this week?
I have a feeling it's going to a specific news item that's happened recently with the Coyotes organization.
That's right. So Darren Dreger reported, I believe it was last week, that the Coyotes are being investigated by the league for violating rules regarding fitness testing draft eligible employees before the 2019 Scouting Combine. I didn't realize that before the Scouting Combine was established and hosted in Buffalo, that every team had the ability to do their own quote unquote Scouting Combine of their draft players from their junior leagues or minor leagues. I was like, that's interesting. And apparently it became such a big deal that the junior teams complained to the league, and the league actually set up rules that says you can only do so many kinds of testing, but physical testing can only be done at the combine. And so I was like, that's interesting. So how much do you think the fine is per violation of this type of testing?
You know, it's kind of hard to say because this is one of those things that's slightly below NHL level. We're kind of on the cusp. We're talking about draft players. It's something that goes under the radar. It might have been happening for a couple of years and we just aren't privy to hear about it. So I don't know. I'd say a fine, maybe $10,000. I don't know.
$250,000 per violation.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a lot.
And the Coyotes have been rumored to have at least 20 violations of this.
Wow.
In quick math, that's $5 million.
Yeah, that adds up to a lot for sure.
And it makes me wonder because I did some further looking into this, and the Coyotes are saying they did not actually have people like do any sort of run test or gym test. They were simply asking them questions about their physical health, their eating habits, any supplements they take, and their exercise regimen. But the NHL itself has come out and said that counts as physical testing because you're asking them physical questions about themselves.
Yeah, from my understanding, the point of order that they're mad about is they are conducting illegal physical testing. So there's amount of questions that can be asked or what have you, kind of interview questions. But what crosses the line is when it goes into physical testing specifically. So I've got a quote from Darren Dreger that says, sources say it's believed that there are, like you said, 20 counts of the Coyotes fitness testing draft eligible players. NHL Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly and NHL lawyers are now managing the case. So when we're discussing this testing that happens to these draft eligible players, I think the key takeaway is what is crossing the line as far as physical testing. And I think you had a good analogy about it earlier, Kyle.
Yeah, the bench pressing. I mean, I can't tell you how much I bench pressed. The last time I bench pressed, it was probably around, I think, 200 pounds. But honestly, that was like 3 to 4 years ago when I was big into bench pressing, and I haven't really been at the gym ever since then. So, but if I come up and say, Matt, how much can you bench press? And you say, 250, is that really a physical test? And the Coyotes say that stuff is kind of gray area because it doesn't really come out and say.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like the players are probably doing it at their own discretion. They're freely doing it. They're not being like held against their will or whatever. It's not necessarily like, I don't know, a flexibility test. It's not. I'm not putting my hands on you. So what's the definition of physical really? Does a trainer have to lay his hands on the kid and give him warm ups and routines, or does he have to place eyeballs on him? Is it any amount of exercise or practice regimen? So really the question is what we don't really know yet. Maybe in a couple days to follow, in the following week or so, we'll know exactly what it is in question that revolves around physical testing. It might be something innocuous, or it could be some instance where they're actually trying to find some high-level data on these players and these kids before they're eligible to be subjected to this type of testing. So it's with something that's kind of up in the air yet. We're not really sure. And I got a quote from Darren Drager that says that each violation, like you mentioned, can carry a fine of $250,000 or more. And club management and amateur scouts around the league are anxiously awaiting the outcome and Commissioner Bettman's ruling. No timeline on when a decision will be reached. So I think if it comes out that the Coyotes are guilty of this is going to be a situation you're going to have across the league as a whole, not just the Coyotes organization. Remember a couple of weeks ago when Bettman, everybody was cracking down on these coaches and their antics. And now Bettman said he's going to release a call-in hotline number or whatever to call in about these situations in the future because they got a report about one coach doing it. So they said, all right, we're going to implement it across the league. Well, if the Coyotes are doing this on their scouting level, then what other teams are doing it? And I think going forward, you're going to see other players and maybe some whistleblowers from these organizations, former employees come out and say, well, we've kind of done this too. And so this is going to be have to conversation we're going to have with all these other teams. And there's going to have to be a hard black or white standard that's set. This is how far you can go, and these are the things that's not allowed. And if you get caught doing these, then fine of $250,000 or whatever.
And of course, the Coyotes did issue a statement for this, and they said, "We are aware of the reports, and we have discussed the matter with the NHL, and we have no further comment this time." So basically, they're not admitting or denying anything, just kind of no comment. So we will see what happens. But one person I want to talk to you, Matt, is my boy, Alex Ovechkin.
That's right. Alex Ovechkin seems to make our sheet of news every week, it seems. He's just on a freaking tear.
He really is. I mean, look at this. He is 2 goals away from 700. And he is inching closer, it seems like almost every game, to Wayne Gretzky. I think, Matt, he can do it. I think he can catch Gretzky and beat him.
I mean, maybe. He might catch him in the goals, but he's not going to touch him in points. But at least having a discussion, there's a possibility. Honestly, it's pretty exciting. Like, I don't get tired of talking about this. I like to say, leave my greats alone. Don't touch my Yzermans and my Messiers and that type. But just to have a conversation of a guy, we've talked about it before, who's able to do in this modern era of high skilled and talent league to do what Gretzky did in the old days, to have a conversation that he might overpass him is quite incredible. In fact, Ovechkin passed Yzerman, I think it was last week in the news or whatever on the all-time list. And I know Yzerman, once he caught wind of that, replied to Ovechkin and after he saw what he did, and he said, if you ever do break Gretzky's all-time record for most goals in the league, after watching your Stanley Cup celebrations, I want to be invited to your party. So I think that's pretty telling. Everybody, even the all-time greats, are on notice. This isn't just, a fanboys in us wanting to see something exciting. Even Steve Yzerman and all the greats, Teemu Selanne, they're all on watch because Ovechkin's living up the life of legends here.
I mean, even the great one himself says that Ovi has a legitimate shot. And if that doesn't say anything compared to any other greats, if the great one himself says, this guy has a chance to break my record, it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Ovechkin, you guys have a lifespan, and then they tailor off as they get older. Their production seems to go down, but Ovechkin has gotten better. I think I read a stat. I didn't write it down because I'm getting tired of writing down all the Ovechkin stats. It gets a little overwhelming, but I think he was only like the second guy after age 35 to have this many points or this many goals in however many seasons. Only second guy in history to do whatever it was. What just speaks to the fact that as time progresses, he's not slowing down. He's heating up, man. We had back-to-back hat tricks the other night. And now that he is so close, we talked about, maybe he's getting old. He might be thinking about retirement. But now that he's so close, and it seems every week he's passing another guy on the great all-time list, I think, honestly, it starts a wonder in his head, maybe I can do this. And maybe I would have retired in a year or two, maybe. But now he might not settle. He might not retire until he completes his goal. And I think, he's a very determined player, Ovechkin, and he's not slowing down. So I don't see any reason why he needs to retire. He might want to see this thing through and see if he can do it for real. And I think that's a very real possibility.
I think he will too. But Matt, let's get off the Ovechkin show a little bit. Like I said, we can talk about it all day. Do you have any other stats for us before we close the show down?
Well, I know the main thing that we haven't got to talk about this episode that I'd like to mention before we close is, I don't know if you've seen this guy, Columbus Blue Jackets goalie Elvis Merzlikins is on fire.
It's actually Merzlikins, but close enough, man.
Whatever. So this guy is 8-0 in 8 starts. He had back-to-back shutouts. He had 5 shutouts in 8 games, which that's 5 shutouts accounts for the most in the NHL. So this guy's been on an absolute freaking tear, and nobody's ever heard of him really, and he's currently leading the league in save percentage. Man, I think he was the number 1 first star of the week this week as well. This guy is on a tear, and he's just one example. There's a couple other hot goalies right now that are just lighting it up and really carrying their team on their back. And it's just incredible to see, because I like to watch the Calder Cup race every year. I like to see players like Makar and them go for it, and see Victor Olofsson. I like to see who's going to win the rookie race, really. And I love to see young talent develop. And especially, we talk about the Preds organization all the time, seeing these young guys come in, seeing where they fit in the NHL lineup. And I like to see these guys, they're highly anticipated. Number 1 picks, number 2 picks in the draft. They come into the league, they make a tear, they're storming out, they're getting goals. My boy Pedersen has been taking a lick around the league lately. He's been getting some slashings and tripping and hooking all over the place lately. But I like to see young players like that see exactly what they can do. And this guy, Elvis, goalie Elvis, he's just another one of those young talent players it's just great to watch them prosper and to know that they've got what it takes to not just make it in the minor leagues and, the AHLs or whatever, but they can do it on the NHL level. And I just always root for those guys because they're like the underdog. So hats off to my guy there. But, honestly, speaking of goalies, he's not the only one that's been hot lately. I'll go ahead and go to some of my milestones sheet here. Vasilevsky is also one of those guys that's been on a tear. He is now the 4th goalie in history to have 150 wins before 250 games. And he was on a 17-game point streak, which is incredible. 17-game point streak, which passes my boy Nikolai Khabibulyan's streak back in 2003. For now, Vasilevsky is the longest streak by a Russian in NHL history. And they used to call him Khabibulyan the Bulin Wall.
I don't even know how to say that name.
Yeah, I know. I threw that out there because everybody knows I like the Russians, and it was a stat about Russians. So hats off to Vasilevsky. Also, another guy, Washington's goalie, Ilya Samsonov, is now the 4th goalie in history to win 16 out of his 21st games. And now some of these stats I think are weighted, because obviously Tampa Bay is a great team. Washington Capitals are a great team. So they make it a little bit easier. But just the fact that you can do it consistent like that, that's really nice. And that does good for the psyche of, a young player or a backup goalie or whatever coming into the league. That does very well. And also a hat tip to my boy Marc-Andre Fleury passes Henrik Lundqvist for 5th all-time in wins.
It's a shame that Lundqvist may retire and not get a cup.
Exactly. And that's kind of sad. I think if he was on a team like a Capitals or whatever, Rangers used to be good, but the last couple of years, they haven't done much for him to help him get any more wins. And that is sad because that's another guy that everybody loves. And a guy that I love, I saved the couple best for last, obviously. My boy Zdeno Chara got presented with the Golden Gloves after having played 1,500 games, which is pretty incredible. I was thinking, man, I wonder if I could skate around with those Golden Gloves, but that might be something you have to hang up in the Hall of Fame shrine with all your awards and stuff in the man cave. I think that's what's going to have to happen for my boy Zdeno Chara. And same number, Jumbo Joe is now the 14th player in history to have 1,500 points. And I will end with Phil the Thrill Kessel has now eclipsed Andrew Cogliano for 6th longest Ironman streak by skating in 831 games straight. So that's one of those random stats that I love. I love my Ironmans. Seeing guys that can stay in there and stay healthy. I think it's whether it's genetics or a play style, but it's good for them guys. It's nice to not be hurt, obviously. So I always appreciate guys that are tough and they're the real deal, the John Waynes of the crowd, and I appreciate that. So hats off to you, Phil the Thrill. Maybe it's those hot dogs that maybe is healthier than everybody thinks. I don't know.
Dude, hot dogs are not healthy at all. I'm sorry.
They taste good though.
But you know what? Ice cream sandwiches are healthier than hot dogs any day of the week.
I'll take it.
So guys, game's coming up. we've got the Preds in Vancouver tonight to take on the Canucks to see if they can't close that road trip out with 2 more points. And then on Thursday night, the 13th, New York Islanders come into town with Barry Trotz. And then on Saturday, the 15th and Sunday, the 16th, we are going to have a back-to-back home-and-home game against St. Louis. Saturday, the 15th, we're going to be in St. Louis. And then on the 16th, they're going to be down here at Bridgestone. And on the 18th, the Carolina Hurricanes come into town. So we're going to have to give a shout-out to the Red Revolution Rampage podcast. And then on the 21st, we're going to be in Chicago to take on a Friday night evening game. And then finally, before we record again, the Columbus Blue Jackets will be coming into town. And maybe we can prevent Elvis Merzlikins from getting a shutout against us. But guys, thank you so much for listening to the show today. I want to say thank you once again to Robby Stanley for joining us. You can find the show on iTunes at Music City Gold, and you can also find us on Twitter at Music City Gold. And if you follow Penalty Box Radio, you can find us on their iTunes feed, which is Penalty Box Radio, or on their website at penaltyboxradio.com. So until next time, guys, we'll see you on the ice.
You've been listening to Music City Gold on the Penalty Box Radio Network. We'd love to interact with you on Twitter. The show can be found at Music City Gold. You can find Kyle at Kyle Hancock, Daniel at CDanDrum, and Matt at Matt Bain 31. Past episodes of the show can be found by subscribing to Music City Gold or Penalty Box Radio on iTunes or at penaltyboxradio.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the ice.